A doctor refused to save a mother of triplets due to lack of money. When he opened her file, he discovered she was his sister, who had been missing for 20 years. The sun had already set behind the buildings of the San Rafael Medical Center when Dr. Michael Brown finished his last surgery of the day. He was a brilliant surgeon, renowned for his skill and perfectionism, but also for the strict discipline with which he treated his patients and residents. To many, that cold-eyed man represented the pinnacle of medical excellence. To others, he was simply a professional devoid of empathy. His immaculate coat and meticulous manners commanded respect, while his distant demeanor created a barrier that was hard to breach. Michael had been working at the hospital for several years. Despite his flawless reputation in terms of clinical outcomes, many low-income patients had left his office with the same anguish they had upon arriving. Those who lacked the necessary coverage to afford expensive procedures were met with his chilly professional judgment. He often argued that high-quality medicine required funding, modern equipment, and a specialized team. Without those resources, he emphasized, excellence couldn't be guaranteed. And if there was no excellence, the patient would lose out. He would not allow himself to settle for mediocrity. Yet behind that shield of intransigence was a man burdened with pressures and remorse. The financial crisis at San Rafael forced him to be ever more selective with the cases he took on. Claire Rivas, the administrator, and Dr. Barron, the department head, reminded him daily that they needed to prioritize surgeries and treatments that generated economic benefits, whether through private insurance or corporate agreements. Patients with no means were often relegated to waiting lists or referred to other facilities with fewer technological resources. That evening, Michael paused in the main corridor of the hospital and observed the hustle and bustle of doctors and nurses rushing around. He felt tired, but above all pressured by the meeting he'd had a few hours earlier with Claire and Dr. Barron. They demanded he review his statistics and prioritize cases based on profitability. In exchange, they promised their support for acquiring new equipment for his surgical area. From an administrative standpoint, it seemed logical, but to Michael, it was starting to weigh on his conscience. However, no matter how much doubt he felt, he maintained his facade of a disciplined, aloof surgeon. Upon arriving at his apartment, he set his briefcase on the table and went straight to the kitchen to make himself a cup of coffee. He was exhausted. That day alone, he had performed 3 lengthy surgeries, 2 of them highly complex. The cup of coffee offered brief solace, but after the first sip, his thoughts wandered to memories he preferred to keep locked away. He knew that in a few minutes, the daily tension would give way to an unbearable silence, and then he wouldn't be able to resist looking at the photo he kept in his room. Like every night, he went to the small room he used as a study. After sitting in a worn-out armchair, he opened the drawer of his desk. He took out a childhood photo in which a boy of about 7 was hugging a slightly younger girl. Both were smiling, oblivious to any worries. It was him and his sister, Sophie. A wave of pain and nostalgia swept through his chest as he remembered that this image was all he had left of her. Sophie had mysteriously disappeared 20 years ago, and neither the authorities nor his family had managed to find out what had happened. Though he had tried not to blame himself, he never shook off the feeling that he should have protected her better. He stood up with the photo in hand, studying it under the soft glow of the lamp. He recalled the days they used to play in the yard, sharing laughter and secrets. His family had fallen apart after she vanished. His parents were consumed by despair and spent all their savings in the search for Sophie. Meanwhile, Michael threw himself into his studies, determined to build a future that would shield him from pain. That was how he ended up at medical school, driven by a determination that soon became an obsession with perfectionism. There was no room for mistakes or feelings. Very few people knew about his sister's story. At the hospital, no one suspected that the acclaimed surgeon carried such a family tragedy, or at least that's what he believed. His distant, inflexible attitude served as armor, keeping colleagues and subordinates at arm's length. That night, as he gazed at Sophie's face in the photograph, a pang of guilt returned. For a moment, He closed his eyes tight and wondered whether, in some way, his behavior toward his most needy patients was linked to his past. Was he punishing others, or was he punishing himself? The question hung in the air. Michael put the photo back in the drawer and returned to the living room to finish his coffee. As he did each night, he mentally reviewed the next day's schedule, several consultations, and a planned surgery for a patient with premium insurance. That would guarantee the hospital income and keep Claire and Dr. Barron pleased. It was exactly what they expected of him, and he, unable to confront his own history, continued to maintain the image of a flawless surgeon who never wavered. Probably, he thought, that was how things had to stay. As the clock struck midnight, the financial troubles at San Rafael grew worse. The administrators couldn't balance the books, and there was talk of shutting down some departments. Claire Rivas, however, was confident that by selecting only profitable cases, the institution could survive. Dr. Barron shared her vision. Both depended on Michael's skill to uphold the hospital's reputation and attract patients with lucrative insurance plans. None of that seemed to affect Michael, or so it appeared. Even so, in recent weeks, he had seemed somewhat distant. His thoughts kept drifting back to the photograph and the memory of Sophie. Although he tried to hide it, some colleagues noticed that during his breaks, he would stare blankly into space. Elena, the head nurse, had tried asking him a couple of times if he was okay, but he always brushed her off. Still, Elena was perceptive and suspected that something troubling was on the surgeon's mind. That night, before going to bed, Michael stopped once more in front of the bathroom mirror. He studied his somewhat tired face and wondered if he had gone too far in his quest to succeed at all costs. Sophie's disappearance had driven him to become the best, but in the process, it seemed he had turned into a hard, closed-off man. He switched off the light and tried to sleep, unaware that very soon the past would come charging back to shake the foundations of his life. For the moment, all he had was his stubborn loyalty to the hospital's rules amid its crisis, and the deep sorrow of spending 20 years without knowing anything about his sister. The following day brought unusual commotion to the entrance of the San Rafael Emergency Department. Early in the morning, an ambulance arrived with its siren blaring. Inside was Sophie, a young woman pregnant with triplets who was facing serious complications. Her partner, Josh, rode with her, his face drawn with worry, clutching her hand as though he feared losing her at any second. The on-duty staff jumped into action at once. A resident physician and 2 nurses helped wheel the stretcher toward the rapid assessment area. Sophie could barely keep her eyes open. Her labored breathing and expression of pain underscored the urgency of her condition. While the team tried to stabilize her vital signs, Josh pleaded for help, his voice trembling as he explained that they did not have health insurance and had come to San Rafael because it was the nearest hospital equipped to handle high-risk pregnancies. At that moment, Eleanor, the head nurse, walked in decisively, checking Sophie's chart to find any information that might guide their immediate intervention. "Please, do something. Don't let anything happen to her or the babies," Josh begged, his voice breaking. Accustomed to tense situations, Elena kept calm and gave precise instructions to the staff. She ordered a quick exam to determine the stability of the fetuses and monitored Sophie's blood pressure, which appeared dangerously high. Meanwhile, Josh, struggling to answer the residents' questions, explained that Sophie had been experiencing severe dizziness and stabbing abdominal pain since the early morning, pain that persisted despite the analgesics. Soon after, the nurses transferred Sophie to a stretcher in the emergency area. Dr. Gustavo Torres, the on-call gynecologist, arrived to examine her with a portable ultrasound machine. After the initial assessment, Gustavo looked worried. One of the triplets seemed to be in fetal distress, and Sophie's blood pressure threatened to trigger complications like preeclampsia. An emergency C-section was critical, but it would be expensive, and given the hospital's grave financial crisis, it had become extremely strict about uninsured patients. Realizing the obstacles, Gustavo went to find Michael Brown, who was in the midst of a post-operative review. The surgeon was known for his skill in complicated interventions, and everyone understood that Sophie's life and the triplets depended largely on the expertise of whoever handled the procedure. Holding the report in his hand, Gustavo walked to the main corridor and spotted Michael talking with Claire Rivas and Dr. Barron. "Sorry to interrupt, but we have an urgent case," Gustavo said, tension lacing his voice. "A woman pregnant with triplets is in severe condition. We need authorization for an immediate procedure." Claire Rivas narrowed her eyes. For months, she had been monitoring every costly intervention at the hospital, and her financial approach had become stricter than ever. Without hiding her concern, she took the report from Gustavo and skimmed through it, confirming her suspicions. Sophie had no insurance or health plan. Frowning, she looked at Michael as though expecting an answer. "This procedure is extremely delicate and expensive," Claire said in an authoritative tone. "How do you plan to cover it if the patient isn't insured?" Michael listened to her question impassively. Deep down, he sensed how urgent the case was, but his experience and the pressure from the administration pushed him to adopt the same stance as always. In a firm voice, he replied, "If there's no insurance, we can't take on these costs. The hospital's financial situation is critical. If we make the imprudent choice to proceed without financial backing, we'll end up hurting other patients who do have coverage." Dr. Barron, eager to maintain the order that Claire had established, nodded gravely. Gustavo, on the other hand, couldn't believe what he was hearing. Likewise, Elena, who had just arrived after checking Sophie's heart rate, felt her blood run cold when she heard Michael's refusal. "We're talking about 3 lives, Michael," Gustavo said, trying to appeal to the surgeon's sense of responsibility. "This woman needs an emergency C-section. Every minute counts." Michael, folding his arms, made it clear he wouldn't give in easily. His reputation and the pressures he was under drove him to stand firm in his decision. Next to him, Claire Rivas reinforced his position, arguing that without insurance to cover most of the costs, the hospital was in no position to take on such a financial risk. Meanwhile, Josh waited in the lounge, consumed by desperation. He had once tried to get Sophie insured, but the premiums were far too high for their situation. Now, he found himself torn between the urgent need to save his partner and their babies and the crushing realization that the hospital was more concerned with its balance sheet than with the lives of his family. Elena, feeling uneasy, approached Michael before he could leave. She knew he had both the authority and talent to operate, and she couldn't believe such a renowned physician would refuse to help a woman on the brink of collapse. "Dr. Brown, please think about what's at stake. This patient can't wait. I've spent my whole life tending to emergency cases, and rarely have I seen such imminent risk." Michael gave her a cold stare. Though he felt a slight tremor deep down, he kept his face composed. "I'm sorry, Elena," he replied, "but the hospital has rules. I can't operate without knowing for sure there will be financial coverage." Gustavo, still standing nearby, clenched his fists in frustration. He found the situation absurd. They had the knowledge and the technical means to save Sophie and her triplets, yet the hospital's financial constraints and internal policy stood in the way. Still, he hesitated to raise his voice any further before Michael and Claire, having witnessed other colleagues fall from grace for challenging the institution's functioning. Meanwhile, Sophie was moved to a stretcher for continuous observation. She felt nauseous and gripped by worsening pain, barely able to catch her breath. She half opened her eyes, searching for Josh, wishing for the reassurance that she herself lacked. The monitors showed alarming fluctuations in her blood pressure, and the fetal heart rates also hinted at instability. A moral tension swiftly mounted. On one side, Claire Rivas and Dr. Barron argued that it was impossible to subsidize every critical uninsured case. On the other, Gustavo and Elena invoked the Hippocratic Oath, insisting that saving lives had to be the priority. In the midst of it all, Michael's voice rang out like an unyielding anchor, reiterating the initial refusal. There would be no surgery without financial backing. Eleanor rushed to the emergency ward to see Sophie up close. The young woman was breathing with difficulty, her abdomen contracting in spasms. In her gaze, was the anguish of someone who understood the gravity of her situation, yet lacked the strength to protest. Josh, desperate, held her hand, tears welling in his eyes, promising he would find a solution. As the hours wore on, Sophie's condition failed to improve. Despite the medication given to stabilize her blood pressure, her discomfort grew, and the monitors offered no good news. Elena and Gustavo exchanged telling looks, preparing themselves to plead again with Michael. And though the surgeon's resolve appeared rock solid, a shadow flickered in his eyes, as though an inner conflict was forming behind his unrelenting exterior. That night, a heavy silence filled the corridors of San Rafael. Sophie's predicament became, minute by minute, a breaking point for Michael's conscience, for Claire Rivas's authoritarian stance, and for the very life of the young mother hovering at the edge of her endurance. Later, Eleanor entered the nursing office with the patient's folder in hand. She wore a deep frown, her heart racing. She had spent the last half hour reviewing Sophie's medical record, searching for any clue that might help her present a compelling argument to convince Michael to operate. Yet she found something more. The woman's birth date and full name strangely matched information she remembered hearing once in a private conversation with Dr. Brown. It wasn't the first time Elena had felt curious about Michael's personal life. Despite his distant manner, there had been rumors a couple of years ago that the surgeon had experienced a family tragedy involving a missing sister. Details were scarce, only that his sister's name was Sophie, and that the family had lost track of her 2 decades earlier. The story lived on in hushed speculation, and no one dared ask him outright, knowing how reserved he was. Elena opened the folder again, scanning the details. Sophie's last name was Brown, and she was born on the exact same day, month and year as the surgeon's sister. Although her records showed a different second surname, matching her biological mother, the ID numbers and place of birth were strikingly familiar. It was too much of a coincidence. Before jumping to conclusions, Elena decided to consult someone she trusted. She found Dr. Gustavo Torres, who at that moment was finishing an exam with another patient in the obstetrics ward. When he was free, she pulled him aside, showing him Sophie's file. Gustavo raised his eyebrows skeptically, but soon grasped why Eleanor had called him over. "Do you really think it could be the same person?" Gustavo asked quietly, careful not to let others overhear. Elena sighed, nervous. "I'm not sure, but the dates line up perfectly. And the full name, it's just too similar. Plus, remember that Michael rarely talks about his family. All we know are a few comments he let slip once, but—" She trailed off, not wanting to sound too intrusive. Gustavo, however, saw how seriously she was taking this. He had heard the rumors about Michael's missing sister, but never confirmed anything with the surgeon himself. He had always been curious whether the doctor's unyielding demeanor toward patients hid a deeper, unresolved pain. "Look, Elena," Gustavo said softly, "we can't bring these suspicions to Michael without stronger evidence. He won't believe us unless we have proof." "I agree," the head nurse replied. "Do you think we should check the hospital's old records or some official database? I want to be sure before I bring this up to Michael." Gustavo nodded firmly. He knew the hospital archives contained a trove of documents spanning several years, though perhaps not going back 20. Still, they might find a reference to past pediatric cases or any record linked to the Brown surname. They also considered checking police records for missing persons, which were sometimes updated with new leads. They headed to San Rafael's archive department, a dusty place packed with shelves of folders and partially digitized documents. The staff member there greeted them politely, accustomed to people searching old files to fill gaps in medical histories. While Elena gave him a brief explanation of what they needed, Gustavo began working in the computer system, entering variations of Sophie's name and the birth date they had noted. It was a tedious process. They spent at least an hour and a half combing through data, past admissions, and any document that might mention the Brown surname. They found nothing conclusive linking this Sophie to the one in Dr. Michael's past. However, they did come across a 20-year-old police report about a minor named Sophie Brown, who had disappeared and was never found. Though brief, the report listed basic details: age, place of birth, and mention of a brother named Michael. Reading it, Eleanor felt a chill run through her. There was no longer any doubt in her mind that, at the very least, the missing Sophie's data coincided with the patient's. It was too great a coincidence. Gustavo, now grave, realized the significance of this revelation. If this Sophie turned out to be the same girl who disappeared 2 decades ago, they were looking at something extraordinary and a serious dilemma. Michael was refusing to operate because she had no insurance, unaware or unwilling to admit that she could be his own sister. "What do we do now?" Elena whispered, clutching the folder to her chest. "We have to talk to Michael. But first, we should confirm the birth records, maybe request a DNA test if this gets serious," Gustavo suggested thoughtfully. "This is a very delicate matter." Elena nodded. She felt a knot in her stomach, fearing what this news might trigger. On one hand, she hoped Michael would show some humanity and realize he had to save Sophie at all costs. On the other, she feared confronting the cold side of the surgeon, the one that refused to get emotionally involved with patients. That same afternoon, Elena found Michael outside the emergency ward, reviewing some files. Cautiously, she approached and noticed he was scowling, clearly on edge after the morning's argument with Claire Rivas. She cleared her throat, waiting for the surgeon to turn her way. "I need to speak with you, doctor," she said in a low voice. "Is there something new with the triplet patient?" Michael asked, barely looking up. Elena's pulse quickened. She stepped aside, signaling him to move away from the bustle so no one could overhear. Once alone, she dared to tell him what she had discovered. She explained the matching dates, the police report about a missing minor, and finally, as gently as possible, revealed her suspicion that the hospitalized Sophie might be the same sister he never spoke about. Michael reacted with disbelief. He frowned and shook his head. "How could you even think that?" It makes no sense," he stated, trying to sound sure of himself, but his voice quivered slightly as he spoke. Elena showed him the printed records. Michael read them in silence, visibly unsettled. He blinked repeatedly, as though unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Inside, he felt a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, fear, and most of all, a sharp stab of guilt that reminded him of all the pain he had carried for years. "It must be a coincidence," he insisted, in a harsher tone. Glancing around anxiously, he lowered his voice. "Lots of people share the same name." Elena bit her lip. "I know, doctor, but there are too many matching details. The same birth date, place of birth, last name. I've worked with you for a long time, and I've heard rumors about your sister. Forgive me if I'm overstepping, but I couldn't just keep quiet." Michael remained silent, at a loss for words. It was obvious that any mention of Sophie disturbed him deeply. Despite his facade of unshakable calm, a rare anxiety appeared in his eyes. "This can't be," he repeated, almost to himself. He ran a hand over his forehead, wavering. For a second, he seemed close to breaking down, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'll verify these details myself. But in the meantime, please don't mention this to anyone." Elena agreed, understanding that she had planted a seed of doubt in him. Michael turned and walked away briskly, trying to hide the turmoil consuming him. On the outside, he kept up the image of a strict surgeon. On the inside, he felt the past closing in, ready to uproot everything he believed unchangeable. As soon as Michael turned the corner of the corridor, Elena was left alone, clutching Sophie's file. She knew this revelation wouldn't end here. What she didn't know was the extent to which the life of this now critical patient, and that of her boss, could change forever at the prospect of such an unexpected reunion. Several days later, in the conference room, Michael sat at his desk, file in hand. Still reeling from what Elena had told him, he silently reviewed the information on patient Sophie Brown. Every line presented details that seemed impossible to ignore. The same birth date as his sister, a hometown matching that of his childhood home, and a second surname appearing in the police reports about his sister's disappearance 20 years ago. Michael flipped through the pages with a furrowed brow. Despite his habit of staying calm in any situation, this time he felt his heart pounding fiercely. Fragments of childhood memories resurfaced. He could see himself running alongside Sophie in his parents' backyard, playing innocent games he thought he'd forgotten. He recalled his mother, fraught with worry, calling them in when dinner time approached. The memories were vague but poignant, stirring up deep emotion. Though he tried to find a logical explanation, maybe it was just an extraordinary coincidence, something inside him warned that these signs couldn't be dismissed so easily. Still, the cool reserve he'd acquired over the years pushed him to remain skeptical. He refused to believe that, right at the most critical moment for this uninsured patient, such a personal connection would suddenly emerge. Meanwhile, in the observation area, Sophie's condition worsened. The nurses observed her blood pressure skyrocketing at an alarming pace. Preeclampsia threatened to evolve into something more severe, and to make matters worse, one of the fetuses showed distress on the fetal monitor. Dr. Gustavo Torres, who hadn't left the case's side, ordered additional tests and closely monitored lab results. He was certain the C-section couldn't be postponed any longer. Each passing minute increased the risks for both Sophie and the triplets. Josh, for his part, had left the hospital a few hours earlier in the hope of securing financial backing. First, he called his family, pleading for an urgent loan to cover Sophie's surgical costs. But his mother and siblings, all with modest incomes, could barely scrape together a small sum that wouldn't even cover the basic hospital fees. Desperate, he reached out to an old childhood friend he hadn't seen in years, as well as some co-workers, trying to gather any amount that might help meet the hospital's demands. He got the same response everywhere, words of encouragement and concern, but little or no financial help. Josh didn't have a strong enough network to help him navigate the hospital's economic policy. He returned to San Rafael with little more than a handful of crumpled bills and a knot of despair in his throat. Stepping into the room, he saw Sophie struggling with pain and felt his world collapsing. "I'm sorry, my love," he murmured, his voice breaking as he knelt beside her bed. "I couldn't get anything more." Sophie barely managed to open her eyes and gaze at him tenderly. Though her condition was worsening, she tried to force a weak smile to comfort him. But the fetal monitor emitted an insistent alarm, signaling that one of the babies was in danger. Gustavo, who had been checking the equipment, frowned and headed into the corridor to find Elena. "We can't wait any longer," he said quietly. "This C-section needs to happen right now." Elena nodded, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Seeing that Michael was still nowhere to be found in the ER area, she mustered her resolve and went to look for him in his office. She found him there, absorbed in thought, eyes fixed on Sophie's file, as though lost in a whirlwind of indecision. "Doctor, Sophie's condition is critical. Gustavo believes one of the babies could suffer irreversible distress if we don't act soon." Michael looked up with a somber expression. He felt torn between the possibility that this woman might be his missing sister and the unyielding hospital policy requiring insurance or solid financial guarantees. His more human side was starting to break through, but he still hesitated to show it. "Claire and Dr. Barron won't approve the surgery without an insurance policy to cover the costs," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual hardness. "They've made the rules crystal clear." Sensing his moment of uncertainty, Elena pressed on. "And what about us? Don't we get a say in this? Sophie's life and 3 babies are hanging in the balance." Michael tensed, his brows knitting in frustration. He recalled the pleading look on Elena's face when she handed him the evidence suggesting Sophie might be his sister. He thought of the distant days when, as a child, he dreamed of becoming a great doctor so he could help others. When had that desire to save lives turned into a cold obsession with perfection and professional acclaim? "I'll do what I can to speak with Claire again," he said, giving a non-committal answer. "I need to look into the hospital's finances. Maybe there's something we can do." Elena realized this was at least a small step forward. She hurried out, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. The surgeon leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, letting his mind drift once more into the past. He saw hazy images of home, of his parents hugging Sophie, of laughter shared at a childhood birthday party. Then he relived the moment they discovered she was missing. The anguish, the desperate search. His father drowning in guilt, his mother nearly driven mad by grief. None of it had been resolved, and over time he had chosen to bury it all under a hardened exterior. But now, that shield was cracking in the face of the possibility that the woman clinging to life in the emergency ward was, in fact, the same girl who vanished 2 decades ago. Meanwhile, Josh emerged once again from the observation room and ran into Elena in the hallway. Seeing his tear-streaked face, she gently asked if he'd managed to raise any money. Josh shook his head, overwhelmed, and she felt a pang of sympathy. No matter how much the attending doctors wanted to help, the San Rafael administration was adamant about not taking on any more expenses without guaranteed payment. The medical and emotional tension mounted with every passing second. Sophie was hovering between life and death, and the monitors kept signaling the possibility of a tragic outcome if surgery didn't happen soon. Shut away in his office, Michael continued sifting through paperwork and through memories he had kept locked away. By late afternoon, a heavy hush had settled over the hospital. No one dared say the word irreversible, but everyone knew time was running out for Sophie and the triplets. Josh sat in the waiting room, his gaze lost. Gustavo and Elena debated how to persuade Michael to operate without delay, and Michael, for his part, felt the past knocking on the door with a force that threatened to shatter his carefully built armor. That day would end with no clear solution, but with the certainty that, one way or another, the truth would come out. Destiny had brought Sophie across Michael's path, and there was no more room for feigned indifference. What began as doubts and revelations was about to become the most pivotal reunion of their lives. At dawn, Dr. Gustavo Torres was in the archives of the San Rafael Hospital, having spent hours combing through records and electronic data in hopes of finding a legal loophole that would allow Sophie's surgery to proceed without serious repercussions for the medical team. But what he uncovered went far beyond a mere budget restriction. He spotted glaring discrepancies in several financial reports, inflated figures that didn't match patient logs, and transfers to unknown accounts. As he cross-referenced lists and receipts, Gustavo felt a growing unease. He knew the hospital was in a financial crisis, but these documents suggested that much of the so-called deficit had actually been fabricated. Funds belonging to a social program earmarked for low-income patients were conspicuously missing. Instead, there were suspicious deposits in dubious accounts, with no trace of how that money was actually used or where it ended up. Every new file he opened provided more damning evidence. It appeared that Claire Rivas and Dr. Barron were siphoning off money behind the staff's back. Even worse was the realization that while they justified cuts in basic services by citing financial losses, countless impoverished patients were being denied care, including Sophie. Gustavo made detailed notes of every anomaly, fully aware that he'd need solid proof if he intended to accuse 2 of the most influential figures at San Rafael. When he finished, he printed copies of the most incriminating documents and left the archives with a grave expression. He had no idea how far this corruption went, nor whether there were other accomplices in different departments. But anger welled up in him at the thought of Claire and Dr. Barron's arrogance, demanding staff neglect uninsured patients while they secretly lined their own pockets. Meanwhile, in her office, Claire Rivas was meeting with Michael Brown. She wore a dark suit and looked impatient. On the table sat a folder containing the estimated cost of Sophie's C-section and the neonatal care for all 3 babies. Claire pointed at it, emphasizing her refusal to authorize the procedure without a reliable payment source. "We can't afford to take on these expenses," she said icily. "Doctor, You must understand the hospital is in a very delicate position. If we go through with surgery on this uninsured patient, we jeopardize our entire financial future." Michael listened in silence, his expression controlled. Yet inside, he felt a growing tension with every word Claire spoke. His personal uncertainty, whether the patient was truly his sister, weighed more heavily than he cared to admit. And the ethical dilemma was crushing him. As a doctor, he knew Sophie couldn't wait much longer. "Claire, the patient is in critical condition," he argued, trying to hide the worry gnawing at him. "Dr. Torres has insisted that we can't delay an emergency C-section without endangering her life and that of the triplets." Claire showed not the slightest concern. She shrugged and fixed her gaze on Michael. "We've already discussed this, Doctor. If you decide to operate without approval, you'll be exposing yourself to sanctions. We could report you to the board for financial malpractice, and believe me, your reputation would be seriously damaged." Michael clenched his fists, fighting back the anger he felt. Claire knew full well how much he cared about his professional ambitions. He had built an impeccable career, and despite his recent doubts, he wasn't willing to see it ruined by a rash decision. Even so, her threat shook him. He knew the administration was fully capable of destroying anyone who defied its rules. "Understood," he responded in a glacial tone. "I'll do what I can to balance things out, but for now, I'm going to follow protocol." Claire nodded with a triumphant air and tapped the folder containing the cost figures. "That's the right attitude. I hope I won't need to remind you again about the hospital's guidelines." Once the administrator left, Michael slumped into his chair, running his hands over his face in exhaustion. He was about to return to his usual routine when Gustavo burst into the office, breathing heavily. Without preamble, he placed a stack of printed pages on Michael's desk. "You need to see this," he said firmly. Michael picked up the papers and started reading them. As he went on, his look of disbelief turned into controlled fury. The evidence of diverted funds, phantom accounts, and falsified records lay there in black and white. Everything pointed to Claire and Dr. Barron having enriched themselves by siphoning off money from a social program supposedly meant to fund care for low-income patients. "This can't be," Michael murmured, though the evidence was overwhelming. He looked up at Gustavo. "How long have you known about this?" "I started digging a couple of days ago because of Sophie's case," Gustavo explained. "I wanted to see if there was some special fund for uninsured high-risk pregnancies. I came across these figures and realized the numbers just didn't add up." Michael fell silent, remembering all the times Claire and Dr. Barron had insisted he prioritize profitable surgeries and turn away patients who couldn't pay. It all fit together now. Internal corruption was being used to inflate certain bills and divert money into private hands. "This changes everything," he admitted, tension evident in his voice. "What do you plan to do?" Gustavo squared his shoulders in resolve. "Report them, of course. I've made backup copies. If the board is honest, they'll have to act. But we need support from someone influential enough to make sure the complaint goes through." Michael understood the danger of such a revelation. Claire and Dr. Barron wouldn't sit idle if they learned that Gustavo and he had discovered their scheme. Moreover, Michael's own future could be jeopardized if the administration took revenge. Still, thinking about how this corruption had harmed people like Sophie filled him with disgust. "And the patient?" Gustavo asked. "Are we going to keep putting off her surgery while Claire grows richer off the very funds that should be covering cases like Sophie's?" Michael remained silent. Until now, he had hidden behind hospital policy to deny Sophie help, at least to delay the decision to operate because of her lack of insurance. But now those rules seemed absurd in light of such blatant injustice. Even so, he felt trapped between medical ethics and the threat of sanctions Claire had just dropped on him. "What you've shown me is enough to expose Claire and Barron," he finally replied. "But without concrete proof or an ally on the board, it won't be that simple. On the other hand, if I dare operate on Sophie, they'll make sure to ruin my reputation, and we might not even get the hospital to cover the costs." Gustavo studied him, hoping to see a flicker of compassion in his eyes. "I know you have a lot at stake, Michael, but as doctors, we have a responsibility here. We can't just ignore this." The surgeon lowered his gaze, weighed down by ever-growing remorse. Since Elena had first raised the possibility that Sophie might be his sister, his conscience had not been the same. On top of that, discovering the breadth of the hospital's corruption made him feel profoundly sick. Still, he couldn't yet bring himself to openly challenge the administration. "I need to think it over," he said, so wearily that Gustavo realized his colleague's inner struggle had become unbearable. The gynecologist gathered his copies and left the office, leaving Michael engulfed in an oppressive silence. The surgeon went over the proof again, realizing he had before him stark evidence of the rot eating away at San Rafael. At the same time, he felt his conscience urging him to do his duty for Sophie and for the 3 babies who still had a chance at life, if only he made the right choice. That night, as the hospital corridors grew nearly deserted, the shadows of corruption pressed down harder on everyone. Michael's dilemma was no longer merely personal. If he disobeyed hospital orders, he could lose his career. But if he followed those orders, he'd be aiding in the cover-up for 2 administrators profiting from the healthcare of society's most vulnerable. The clash between medical ethics and institutional ambition had just intensified, and Sophie's future hung by an ever-fraying thread. The San Rafael Hospital remained steeped in tension, overshadowed by the looming financial crisis and the fragile condition of Sophie, the uninsured, expectant mother of triplets. Amid this climate of uncertainty, Elena strode down the halls, clutching a sealed envelope. Her face displayed a mix of anxiety and resolve. She had managed to obtain conclusive evidence regarding Sophie's identity. Ever since she first suspected Sophie might be Dr. Michael Brown's missing sister, the head nurse had thrown herself into the investigation wholeheartedly. She knew it bordered on an ethical gray area to dig through confidential records, but she also felt a moral duty to uncover the truth affecting the patient's life. After overcoming numerous hurdles, she had finally obtained a copy of the birth records and partial DNA confirmation, proving that Sophie was indeed Michael's sister. Eleanor had kept the news under wraps for a few hours, weighing how best to break it to the surgeon. She knew Michael was a man whose heart had been hardened by time and pain, yet she believed that such a shattering truth would break through his defenses. At last, with no further delay, she headed to Michael's office. She knocked softly on the door, feeling her pulse quicken. "Come in," came the surgeon's voice from the other side. When he saw her step over the threshold, Michael caught the grave look in her eyes and knew at once it wasn't a minor matter. Elena stood in front of his desk, extending the sealed envelope, asking him to open it. Somewhat skeptical, Michael broke the seal and withdrew the documents in silence. His expression shifted as he read through the details. The genetic data and the information perfectly matching that of his long-lost sister Sophie, who had disappeared 20 years before. For a moment, there was a funereal hush. Michael looked up at Elena, unsure how to react. She could see his rapid heartbeat and the almost imperceptible tremble in his hands. He felt the ground shift beneath him. The woman he had been refusing to treat, or at least hesitating to operate on for lack of funds, was the very girl he used to play with in childhood, the one who vanished on that fateful day, leaving him with a guilt he had never been able to shake. How did you get this?" he asked quietly, staring at the documents. Elena didn't go into detail about the many steps she'd taken. She simply explained that she had confirmed the match in multiple records and, given the urgency of saving Sophie's life, felt it was essential for him to know the truth. "She's your sister, Michael," the head nurse reiterated. "There's no question." The surgeon closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair, his mind flooded with memories he'd tried to keep buried. In an instant, he saw 5-year-old Sophie's happy face darting around the backyard. Then he saw the anguish of their parents when every trace of her had disappeared. The weight of that failure crushed him once again. He had devoted his life to medicine, partly to atone for not finding her. And now, fate had placed Sophie in his hands at the most critical juncture of her life. Eleanor stood in silence, respecting his turmoil. At last, Michael straightened and, in a trembling voice, made a confession that had haunted him. I remember the day she vanished. I couldn't protect her. We fought over some childish thing. She ran off, and by the time I realized, she was gone. He had never spoken those words aloud to anyone at the hospital. Elena sensed that the icy barrier which defined Michael was finally cracking, allowing his vulnerability to show. "Now she's here," Elena reminded him gently, "and she and those triplets need you." Michael nodded slowly, but the moment was shattered when Claire Rivas appeared in the doorway, interrupting the intimate scene. She carried a folder under her arm, and upon seeing the papers on his desk, she frowned. Apparently, she sensed the situation was moving beyond her control. "I need to speak to you alone, Doctor Brown," she said, throwing a sidelong glance at Elena, who took the hint and left, though not before giving Michael a final look of encouragement. Once they were alone, Claire shut the door carefully. She sat across from the surgeon, adopting a calculated posture. Her voice took on an oddly congenial tone, quite unlike her usual manner. "Michael, I know you've been uneasy about the triplet patient's case. I'd like to propose something that could benefit all of us." He studied her warily. Ever since Gustavo's discovery of the financial irregularities, Michael knew Claire had many shady secrets. Without openly saying so, he could tell she was about to leverage her power to manipulate him. "What do you mean?" he inquired coolly. Claire interlocked her fingers and mustered a smile meant to be persuasive. "Let's say that if you maintain your stance of not operating on this patient without proper financial coverage, we could show our gratitude for your loyalty with a promotion. Imagine a pay raise, a larger budget for your surgical unit, and maybe even a direct recommendation for a seat on the medical board." A shiver of disgust ran through Michael. His worst fear was materializing. Claire was essentially bribing him to keep ignoring Sophie's dire situation. For a second, he hesitated, as if part of his old professional ambition tempted him to consider the offer. For years, he had dreamed of greater recognition, more resources for his procedures, and the possibility of becoming a national figure in his field. However, something inside him had changed. Those photographs, the DNA results, the memory of his lost sister, all that had happened in recent days pushed his conscience in the opposite direction. "What about the patient?" he asked, wanting to lay bare Claire's intentions. The administrator shrugged. "As you know, there are lower-level hospitals that might take her in. Of course, that would be risky for her and the fetuses. But if she has no money, there's nothing we can do. It's not our responsibility." Michael clenched his fists under the table. His anger and sadness mixed with a hint of remorse. He had been complicit with that logic for far too long. Claire went on, "We need brilliant doctors who back our administrative decisions. We can't subsidize everyone who lacks resources. I know you understand." Michael's silence stretched out for several long seconds. In his mind, he kept seeing Sophie, once the little girl he loved so dearly, now lying in a hospital bed, facing a grim prognosis if she didn't receive immediate treatment. "I'll think about it," he finally replied in a neutral tone. Claire, taking this as a sign of compliance, smiled before getting up. She placed a hand on Michael's shoulder and left the office, leaving him staring into space. When the door clicked shut, the surgeon let out a shaky breath. He felt trapped between two fires. On one side, Claire's proposal, which promised him a bright future at the cost of Sophie's life. On the other, his conscience, urging him to do what was right. The revelation that this patient was truly his sister had awakened his sense of responsibility, and above all, rekindled the forgotten affection from his childhood. This was no longer just a professional quandary. It was a conflict bound up with his deepest traumas and the chance at redemption. If he let Sophie die, he would not only lose the sister he believed gone forever, his soul would also sink irreparably into guilt. On the other hand, defying Claire and Dr. Barron could mean hurling his medical career into an abyss. With the DNA results still on his desk, Michael stood and gazed out the window, contemplating the buildings beyond. What would I do if I could turn back time, he wondered, recalling the day Sophie vanished without a trace. Perhaps this was his last opportunity to make up for that tragic past and honor the medical vocation he had once embraced. A breeze rattled the glass, whispering what felt like encouragement. Though he still wouldn't speak it aloud, he knew deep down that his moral compass was beginning to outweigh any bribe, and he sensed it wouldn't be long before he made the decision that would shape his destiny, and Sophie's, as well as that of the unborn triplets. A cold wind rattled the windows of San Rafael Hospital in the early morning, while inside, the atmosphere grew more anxious by the minute. Sophie remained in critical condition, and the specialists insisted it was urgent to perform a high-risk C-section to save both her life and that of the triplets. Yet the administration refused to budge without clear financial backing. That night, as time worked against them, Michael wavered between two opposing forces, his medical conscience and the legacy of a past returning with full force. A few hours earlier, Josh had roamed the break rooms and the hospital's busiest corners, seeking out nurses, orderlies, anyone who might offer financial help. He carried a small cardboard box, hoping to fill it with donations. Everywhere he went, he explained to anyone willing to listen the dire situation Sophie faced and the hospital's refusal to act without some monetary guarantee. "Even if it's just a little, please help us," he pleaded, voice shaking. "My wife and my children's lives are in danger." Some people offered coins, small bills, or promises to donate later. A few sympathetic co-workers handed over more generous contributions. But by nightfall, Josh saw with dismay that the total he'd collected was still far too little to cover the emergency procedure. Even so, that show of solidarity from many staff members hinted that a faction within San Rafael was willing to stand against the administration's unfair policies. Meanwhile, Michael remained in his office, enveloped in a silence thick with memories. The DNA test results and the other documents confirming that Sophie was his sister still lay on the desk. Though he'd reread them several times, he couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief and remorse sweeping over him. After so long, Sophie had returned to his life in the most unexpected way and under the worst possible circumstances. In a sudden burst of emotion, Michael closed his eyes and let himself recall, in detail, the day Sophie disappeared 20 years earlier. He had been around 10, Sophie barely 8. They grew up in a small house in a quiet neighborhood where they played ball and raced around on their block. That day, they argued about something trivial. Sophie wanted Michael to let her play with his older friends, and he refused, saying she was too little and would spoil their fun. Upset, Sophie ran out into the street. In his childish innocence, Michael thought she'd be back in a few minutes, but she wasn't. When he went looking, she was nowhere to be found. Hours passed before they called the police and asked neighbors and friends to comb the area. The family was gripped by despair, especially his parents, who launched a relentless search. But days turned into weeks, and the little girl never turned up. Rumors spread, from a possible kidnapping to the idea that Sophie had suffered an accident and no one had reported it. Michael pictured his parents, eaten up by guilt and helplessness. He remembered trying to be the strong one in the family, despite his own heartbreak. That tragedy shaped the course of his life. He resolved to become a doctor, partly to assuage the pain he felt and the sense of having failed. From that point on, he pursued perfectionism and success obsessively, avoiding anything that reminded him just how vulnerable human life could be. When the flashback faded, Michael opened his eyes and stared into nothingness. The emotional jolt had left him drained. He rose from his desk and left his office without a specific destination, wandering the hospital's deserted corridors. He passed the waiting area where, hours before, Josh had placed the contributions in an improvised donation box. He looked around the now empty space and felt a pang of empathy. He knew that, in some small way, ordinary people had joined forces to support Sophie. Yet, deep inside, he also knew that those collective efforts wouldn't be enough, and that the only real chance to save her was for a surgeon, him specifically, to dare to challenge the rules set by Claire Rivas and Dr. Barron. His heart heavy with uncertainty, he left the hospital close to midnight and headed home. He dropped his briefcase on the floor and went straight to the bathroom mirror. Under the dim light, he saw his reflection, a man who, in many eyes, epitomized discipline and excellence, but who in truth was weighed down by an unbearable guilt. For a long time he stood there, scrutinizing his own eyes, as though seeking in his gaze the answer his rational mind couldn't provide. He couldn't sleep. He paced the living room, trying to arrange his thoughts. For years, he had obeyed the administration's rules and clung to his own cold demeanor to keep suffering at bay. But now, his sister's life, the sister he thought he'd lost forever, was hanging by a thread, and he held the scissors. Remembering the tenderness with which they once played only magnified his urge to protect her, in spite of all the threats looming over his career. At some point, in a piercing moment of clarity, he realized he could no longer be the aloof surgeon who turned his back on patients with no resources. This time, it wasn't just another file. It was Sophie and her 3 babies, who still had a chance if he acted. Staring at his own reflection, he spoke in a low voice that reverberated in the darkness. "I can't fail you again." As the night wore on, sleeplessness and guilt mingled with his growing desire to set things right. Images from his childhood swirled through his mind. His parents clinging to the hope of finding Sophie, the long trips they took searching from town to town, the flyers bearing her photo taped to posts and windows. Remembering each detail hurt, but it also gave him strength. Maybe now, he really could do something for her. When dawn broke, Michael was still standing in the same spot, his eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, yet filled with resolve. He knew the road ahead would be tough. If he chose to confront Claire and the administration, he could lose everything: his prestige, his position at the hospital, even his financial stability. But was letting Sophie die for the sake of his career really an option? He felt a blend of guilt and fraternal love tipping the scales in one direction. He had to save Sophie, no matter what. That conviction, which had been forming since he first suspected the truth, now blossomed into an unshakable certainty. Perhaps life was granting him the second chance he'd believed lost forever. Before heading back to the hospital, he took a deep breath and cast one last glance at the mirror, as though seeking confirmation in his own reflection. Fear gnawed at him, but he also felt more alive than ever, clinging to the idea that this time he would not let fate take his sister away without fighting to the very end. Michael arrived early at the hospital that morning, dark circles under his eyes and a steely resolve in every movement. He'd spent the entire night pacing his apartment, recalling all his childhood memories with Sophie and weighing the consequences of defying the usual protocols. As he crossed the threshold of the emergency department, he felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. He would no longer allow himself any hesitation. The time had come to act. The first place he went was the room where Sophie lay, surrounded by monitors capturing alarming readings. Josh, who had kept vigil by her side, stood up the moment he saw Michael. Though his eyes were weary, there was a spark of hope in them when he noticed a new resolve in the surgeon, replacing the coldness he had shown until then. Has something changed, Doctor?" Josh asked in a trembling voice. Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and nodded gravely. A lump formed in his throat at the sight of this man, fighting desperately for the life of his partner and their unborn children. Without further delay, he stated that the surgery would be done, no matter what. Josh let out a sigh of relief that quickly turned into quiet sobs. Shortly afterward, Michael found Gustavo and Elena in the main corridor. They had nearly given up hope of persuading him, but a single glance at his face told them something had shifted. When Michael told them he would operate on Sophie regardless of the financial restrictions, Elena hugged him tightly, and Gustavo exclaimed, "Finally!" echoing through the hallway. "We need to prep the OR right now," Gustavo said, checking his watch. "Sophie can't wait any longer. One of the fetuses has irregular heartbeats, and her blood pressure is still going up." They hastily assembled an emergency team. Eleanor alerted the nurses, who rushed to gather the necessary instruments for a high-risk C-section. Meanwhile, Michael meticulously reviewed Sophie's chart, double-checking her latest blood tests and the fetal monitoring results, which indicated at least one baby was in distress. The outlook was grim. If they didn't act quickly, the outcome could be devastating. All the commotion soon reached Claire Rivas, who stormed into the operating area, furious and demanding an explanation. The moment she saw Michael in scrubs, ready to begin, she launched into a threatening tirade. "What do you think you're doing, Doctor?" she spat. "We already discussed this. Without the necessary financial coverage, the hospital can't authorize this operation." Michael stood firm, watching her with a calm that seemed to shatter his former protective shell. He had reached a breaking point where conscience overruled any intimidation. "This patient isn't going to die on my watch, Claire," he replied firmly. "If you want to file a report with the board or fire me, go ahead. But first I'm going to save her and her babies." Claire went pale. Seeing she could no longer sway him with threats, she tried a different tactic, reminding him of the promotion and benefits she'd promised if he refused to operate. But Michael, now fully aware of the corruption Claire and Dr. Barron had been concealing, ignored her and ordered the team to wheel Sophie into the operating room. As the door slammed shut, Claire was left outside, face red with rage, hurling threats that echoed down the empty corridor. Inside the OR, tension mingled with hope. Michael glanced around at the nurses and doctors who stood ready to assist without hesitation. Gustavo took his position, prepared to handle any obstetric emergency. Elena adjusted the medications meant to control Sophie's blood pressure, which was dangerously high. Sophie looked exhausted, her condition growing more precarious by the minute. Just as they were finishing the anesthesia prep, one of the monitors sounded an alarm. One of the baby's heart rate was dropping fast. Sophie's preeclampsia had worsened. There was no time to lose. Gripping the scalpel, Michael signaled the start of the emergency C-section. Every move mattered now. Sophie's life and the lives of the triplets all depended on his skill and determination. Silence was broken only by the team's clipped instructions and the beeping of the machines. Under the OR lights, Michael worked with the steady precision he was known for, but this time, his heart beat with a different intensity. He felt that beyond any financial or administrative concerns, he was about to make good on an intimate pledge, to finally mend a past haunted by guilt and reconnect with the compassion he had buried for so long. While Claire raged outside, threatening lawsuits and demanding that Michael be stopped, a battle for life was being waged inside. The nursing staff and Gustavo rallied together as never before, knowing that if they saved Sophie and the babies, the risk would be worth it. For the first time in a long time, the hospital, mired in moral crisis, was animated by a spirit of true medical vocation. Sophie's fate and Michael's own future were now condensed into every cut, every suture, every heartbeat blipping on the monitors, and the unshakable resolve of a surgeon who had finally decided to break free from his own chains. Inside the operating room at San Rafael Hospital, tension ran at a fever pitch. The surgical lights illuminated Michael's focused face as he prepared for the emergency C-section on Sophie, his sister, missing for 20 years. A small group of nurses, led by Elena, moved quickly around him, handing him the instruments he required. Off to one side stood Dr. Gustavo Torres, overseeing the monitoring of the triplets, checking each one's heart rate and calling out any warning signs that popped up on the screens. Meanwhile, outside, Claire Rivas was unleashing her fury on the administrative staff, threatening lawsuits and dismissals for anyone who dared support this uninsured intervention. But inside that sterile room, the fight for life took center stage. The hiss of the respirator and the steady beeping of various monitors composed the soundtrack of a race against time. Pale-faced and with eyes closed, Sophie clung to every flutter of her baby's hearts. Her blood pressure remained dangerously high, exacerbating the risk of hemorrhages and other complications. "Stay calm," Elena murmured to Michael, noticing the tension in his expression. "Trust your training." Until recently, Michael had hidden behind a shield of detachment to avoid emotional entanglements with his patients. But this time, every incision carried the weight of saving not just any patient, but his own sister, and 3 tiny lives on the verge of entering the world. His scalpel moved with practiced surgical precision, but every cut was also watched by Gustavo, ready to intervene if something got out of hand. "I'm seeing a serious drop in one of the baby's heart rates," Gustavo announced, eyes never leaving the monitor. "We need to move faster." Michael nodded, his breath held tight. He made the incision along the lower abdomen and, together with Elena, began delivering the first of the triplets. But at the critical moment, they faced a sudden hemorrhage. Sophie's uterus was bleeding more than expected, endangering not just the fetuses, but the mother as well. A chill swept through the OR as blood rapidly soaked the sponges. "More packs quickly," Michael ordered, his voice tense yet firm. "And get extra fluids ready." Eleanor and the nurses sprang into action, handing over fresh sponges to stem the blood loss, administering the necessary meds to stabilize Sophie's blood pressure. Meanwhile, Gustavo, acting as direct support, closely monitored the fetal heart rates, knowing that one of the triplets was on the brink of oxygen deprivation. Every minute that passed made the situation more precarious. Elsewhere in the hospital, turmoil was unfolding on another front. Furious over Michael's defiance, Claire Rivas demanded that someone stop the surgery. But when she tried to push her way into the OR, 2 nurses, following strict sterile protocol, barred her from entering. "Procedure in progress," they stated firmly. Unable to force her way in without violating basic surgical rules, Claire had no choice but to wait outside, fuming, vowing retribution and threatening to contact the board members. While Claire insisted the hospital couldn't foot the bill, Gustavo was fighting another battle. For days, he'd been gathering documents that exposed Claire and Dr. Barron's corruption, altered records, suspicious bank accounts, and the misappropriation of funds from a social program ironically meant to help patients like Sophie. With a few discreet allies, Gustavo was putting the finishing touches on a case file to present to the authorities. San Rafael teetered between 2 forces, those fighting for life and those profiteering without shame. Back in the operating room, the most critical moment had arrived. Michael and his team managed to stabilize the bleeding just in time to deliver the first baby. A tiny, premature newborn let out a faint cry once its airways were cleared. Elena wrapped the baby in sterile blankets and placed it into a makeshift incubator set up in the OR. Immediately, Michael focused on saving the other 2. The second triplet arrived with a stronger cry, offering a brief glimmer of relief. But the third baby, the one whose heart rate was so concerning, was slow to respond. "Hurry! His oxygen levels are too low," Gustavo warned, directing the nurses as they positioned a mask over the baby's face. The next few seconds felt endless. Michael, his heart in his throat, watched them stimulate the infant to get him breathing on his own. Finally, a weak cry broke the tension, flooding the room with relief. 3 cries, 3 fragile lives that clung to existence thanks to Michael's surgical skill and the unwavering support of the team. Sophie, extremely weak, showed signs of shock, but quick intervention to close up her incision and regulate her blood pressure helped stabilize her. Though the danger was far from over, the first post-op minutes were promising. With a sigh of relief, Michael regained his composure and began carefully suturing the wound, minimizing any further complications. Meanwhile, Gustavo received a text notification on his phone. His trusted contacts had compiled the last pieces of evidence against Claire and Dr. Barron. The complaint was ready to be filed at any moment. Now, as life itself overcame danger and pain inside the OR, the gears of justice were starting to turn, poised to expose those who had turned healthcare into a murky business. A while later, which felt like an eternity, Michael concluded the operation without taking his eyes off Sophie, who lay unconscious on the gurney. Though she was extremely weak, her condition was finally stable, and the triplets were breathing under the vigilant care of the neonatal team. The surgeon, his hands still stained with blood and a lump in his throat, dared to feel a glimmer of hope. He had achieved what he'd always aspired to, but had never fully understood until now, saving lives driven by the purest love. That very night, while Sophie and her 3 babies rested in the intensive care unit, Gustavo put the finishing touches on the official complaint. Judgment Day was approaching for Claire and Baron, and with it, the chance for a new beginning at San Rafael. Only echoes of the anguish that had filled the operating room remained, along with the certainty that Michael, having overcome the greatest challenge of his life, was finally on the path to redemption. The morning after the operation dawned bright at San Rafael Hospital. The tension that had built up over the last few days began to ease, but the echoes of the major surgery still reverberated in every corner. Sophie remained in the intensive care unit, intubated and hooked up to various monitors, while her 3 premature babies lay in special incubators. No one would forget the night when Michael Brown, until then seen as a cold, calculating surgeon, risked his career to save the mother and the triplets. Gustavo Torres, for his part, had spent the last few hours submitting the documentation exposing the corruption of Claire Rivas and Dr. Barron. Capitalizing on the commotion sparked by the emergency C-section, the gynecologist took advantage of the situation to approach the hospital's higher-ups. Armed with backup copies and evidence of fraudulent bank transactions, he revealed the scheme of misdirected funds that had been undermining the hospital for some time. By midday, a special committee of the board of directors held an urgent meeting to assess the evidence. The reaction was swift. Claire and Dr. Barron were suspended from their positions and formally put on track for dismissal, with possible criminal charges pending. Many employees, who had remained silent out of fear, quietly celebrated the news that promised a profound change. Meanwhile, Michael waited anxiously outside the ICU, a far cry from the man he had been just weeks before. The memory of the surgery was still fresh in his mind. He recalled how time seemed to stand still every time the monitors beeped irregularly, and he feared for Sophie's life and the lives of the tiny babies. Now, the outlook seemed hopeful. Though still delicate, the triplets were breathing on their own in their incubators, and Sophie showed slight signs of improvement. That afternoon, Elena approached Michael with a hopeful smile. She told him Sophie had started to come around, and if all went well, they might be able to remove the ventilator in a few hours. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He had spent 20 years wondering what had happened to his sister, burdened by guilt and unspoken sorrow. The thought of seeing her open her eyes and being able to speak with her moved him more than he dared to admit. When he finally entered the room, he found her with heavy eyelids, trying to adjust herself in the bed. Her voice was hoarse and her face drawn. But when she looked at him, Sophie's eyes shone with a mix of astonishment and confusion. Cautiously, Michael approached, not wanting to overwhelm her. For a moment that felt endless. Neither of them spoke. She stared at him for a long while, attempting to piece together fragments of memory blurred by pain and sedatives. It was Elena who, gently, explained that this surgeon was someone extremely important in her life. "Sophie, this is Michael," the head nurse whispered. "Your brother." The young woman blinked in disbelief, and tears immediately began streaming down her cheeks. Though the reasons behind her disappearance for 2 decades remained a mystery, Sophie's heart seemed to recognize him at once. With a trembling voice, Michael murmured apologies that carried years of buried sorrow. "Forgive me," he said, delicately taking her hand. "I searched for you, but I failed. I never knew where you were." Through her sobs, Sophie reached out to touch Michael's face. Her words faltered at first, but at last she managed to express, in a fragile voice brimming with emotion, that she didn't blame him for anything. All that mattered was that after so much pain, they had found each other again. Though she couldn't clearly remember all that had happened over the years, she understood that the man who had saved her life, and that of her children, was the same boy who had once played with her and chased her around their parents' backyard. The following days passed carefully, but they were filled with the joy of recovery. Under Elena and Gustavo's close watch, Sophie's condition stabilized. Whenever Michael visited her in the ICU, he spent a few moments sharing memories of their childhood and explaining little details about his current life. Josh, whose face lit up at seeing Sophie out of danger, spent hours talking to the triplets through the walls of their incubators, brimming with excitement for the future. Although they were premature and delicate, the three babies responded well to treatment, clinging to life with every breath. On the morning Sophie was able to sit up for the first time, Elena and Gustavo arranged a private moment. They brought in one of the triplets, wrapped in a soft blanket, so the mother could hold her child close. Sophie burst into tears the moment she felt that tiny life, so close to being lost, resting against her chest. Josh stood by her side, and together they gazed at their child, grateful beyond words. At the doorway, Michael watched silently, deeply moved by the tender scene, affirming the significance of the decision he had made. Shortly afterward, in a move that sealed Michael's redemption in the eyes of his colleagues, the board of directors formally acknowledged Gustavo's complaint. Claire and Dr. Barron were officially removed from their positions and faced legal actions for embezzlement and corruption. The news spread quickly throughout the hospital, reigniting the hopes of many professionals who, for months, had seen how the greed of a few jeopardized the hospital's mission of saving lives. With both administrators gone, the path to structural reforms opened wide, including the creation of a real emergency fund for cases like Sophie's. In the days that followed, Michael stayed by Sophie's side every step of the way. Though there was no detailed account of what had happened to her 20 years earlier, she managed to recall parts of her story, a series of events that tore her away from the family, legal complications, and the misfortune of ending up in the hands of people who failed to help her. Despite the pain such confessions stirred, both of them felt that, by sharing them, they were starting to mend the bonds broken by the past. Eventually, when Sophie was discharged from the ICU and moved to a regular room, she asked to see Michael and Josh. Together, they looked on as nurses brought in the three babies, still needing special care but whose survival now felt nothing short of miraculous. Awkwardly cradling one of the little ones, Michael sensed for the first time the power of a family that was beginning to blossom after years of darkness. It was a moment of tenderness and relief, impossible to describe in words. On the day Sophie and the triplets left the hospital, Michael said goodbye to them at the main entrance, surrounded by colleagues who applauded warmly. He was like a changed man. Gone was the relentless, detached surgeon who once prioritized hospital profits above all else. His expression now revealed humility and gratitude, and as he bade farewell, he promised that once the babies were a bit stronger, they would all meet to start creating new family memories. That same night, Michael returned to his apartment and, for the first time, took the old childhood photograph from the drawer where he had kept it hidden. Beside that picture, he placed a recent one. Sophie holding one of the triplets, her smile radiating hope. This gesture symbolized the rebirth of a family story that had been severed for 2 decades, now recovered through the power of love and the calling of medicine. In the weeks that followed, San Rafael Hospital began a restructuring process in which Michael took an active role, proposing more compassionate policies and pushing for funds to reach those who truly needed them. His personal evolution became an example to many. He was no longer the cold surgeon they had once known, but a professional who understood that saving lives meant more than just technical skill. It required compassion, courage, and the willingness to risk everything when justice demanded it. That ending paved the way for a new beginning. With Claire and Dr. Barron out of the picture and Sophie's family finally reunited, Michael realized that true success wasn't found in perfect clinical records, but in the ability to love and protect the lives of others. And so, as the sun set behind the facade of the newly reformed hospital, one surgeon, a long-lost sister, and 3 newborn babies shone with a hope that San Rafael would never lose again. Michael and Sophie's story reminds us that life often forces us to choose between our personal aspirations and the urgent need to help others. Sometimes, the fear of losing what we've achieved or an obsession with perfection pulls us away from our true purpose, to serve and protect the lives of those around us. Michael's courage in breaking the unfair rules to save his sister and nephews proves that doing good is not just a gesture, it's a profound act of transformation. When we dare to see beyond our personal interests and extend a hand to those in need, we leave trails of light in a world often overshadowed by darkness. Changing our personality to make the world a better place doesn't mean giving up who we are, but rediscovering our capacity to empathize and love. It means reclaiming the true meaning of solidarity and recognizing that every small act of kindness can spark hope in others. In this way, step by step, we become instruments of change, building a fairer and more humane future for all. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you enjoyed this story and found it as moving as we did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more content. See you in the next adventure.